podcast. I am Dr. Tim Teel, and I am the Doc of Unlock. Today's going to be an interesting one. This is probably the podcast that'll get me kicked plumb off the internet, and if it is, you'll know I touched a nerve because what we're going to talk about today is some observations that has led me to the conclusion of the possibility of what DNA is and is not. And I believe that I have some really, really good pieces of evidence without the proof, although I think there is some bench evidence out there for pointing us in the right direction of this new paradigm about deoxyribonucleic acid or DNA, as it's commonly known. Out there, the common teaching is that 97% of DNA is junk, because we only understand about 3% of it and what it codes for. And I'm here today on this podcast, going to introduce a new concept, a new paradigm, and a new thought, and I'll show you why I believe that that new paradigm may actually have some weight and some sustenance or substance to it, because there are a number of observations that I've made, and as I have worked with patients and with people, I believe that when we work with them as if there were a lot more information stored in that DNA other than just calling it junk, uh, is evidence without the proof that in fact there's a lot more information stored in our DNA than what we've been led to believe or what we believe that we believe. Long ago, when I was in residency, there was a very wise instructor that I had. He was an ear surgeon out on the East Coast, and he took me aside one day and he said, Tim, he said, no, don't let anybody kid you. No, there's a lot more that we don't understand about these bodies and how they work than what we do understand. And he said, if there's anybody that ever tells you any different, run away from them. They are dangerously deluded. There is a lot that we have to learn about these bodies. And I've taken that to heart, and it made me a relatively unpopular human being in medicine because if you challenge long held beliefs in medicine, you get labeled a disruptor, an outlier, a freak, a weirdo, a woo-woo, something like that. There's a lot of different names that we call people that just don't march along to the drummer as we have established the cadence of the information out there. And I guess that's my greatest gift and my biggest curse is questioning the current paradigm and saying, are we absolutely certain that that's right? And how can it possibly be that 97% of DNA is actually junk? That is a concept that never has rung true to me. If you don't know anything about DNA, what we do understand about it. Number one, first of all, we've only known about it for about 70 years or so, and what was deemed as a discovery by Watson and Crick back in the mid 50s. Interestingly enough, Watson and Crick didn't discover DNA. They actually hijacked the research of a young lady that oddly enough died of a DNA related disease known as cancer. But her name escapes me at the moment. But she was a 30 some odd year old young lady that had actually discovered DNA by taking X-rays of it. And Watson and Crick actually took credit for her research, and that's why we call it history and not her story. Bad joke, but it is true. Um, my point is that in the 70 years or so that we have known about DNA, we understand about 3% of it, and we understand that about 3% of our DNA codes for the proteins that create or make our entire physical body, and that means every single protein, every single cell, every single enzyme that exists in the human body is encoded in 3% of our DNA, and there's an entire copy of our DNA code in every single 35 trillion cells in your body, give or take about 10 trillion. Um, And we understand about 3% of it. That makes it, that makes DNA the most powerful biochemical information storage system in the known universe. Okay. There's a complete copy of you 35 trillion times. Every single cell in your body has a complete copy of you, and that only accounts for 3%, 3%, give or take a few percent of the DNA in your entire genome. So what the heck else is in there in that other 97% of DNA? Because to refer to 97% of the most powerful biochemical information storage system in the known universe just sounds a little not quite right. And so, what I'd like to do today is to present to you a theory about what the other 97% of that powerful biochemical information storage system is in your body, and show you the evidence of why I believe it is that way. But no, let me tell you a few stories about how I came to this conclusion and why it's so incredibly important, and what the implications are for our entire society. Because if I'm correct, then this is a potentially civilization changing bit of information. Because if I'm correct, then we have the ability to manipulate our own DNA. And I think we've already found evidence of that. It is not a fixed piece of information. In fact, I am fairly well convinced that that our entire long-term memory is stored in DNA. And I'll tell you why that is. Let's consider for just a moment the life of the salmon. Maybe you know, maybe you don't know about the life cycle of a salmon. The salmon, was spawned way up high in the mountains. Whether it's on the Pacific or the Atlantic, it doesn't make any difference. That fish was hatched from eggs that were laid last fall by his folks. And they laid their eggs, their buddies fertilized them, and then they died. And there was absolutely no contact between the fish that laid that egg and the fish that was hatched from that egg. And so that egg, that fertilized egg, laid there in that riverbed all winter long, and in the spring it hatched out. That little baby salmon starts swimming around, and he starts eating bugs and so forth. And as he continues to grow, he starts sliding downstream. And as he grows and grows and grows, he moves on downstream, continues to eat bugs. He gets washed over the waterfalls and so forth. And eventually, he makes it out to the ocean. And he will swim around in the ocean for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 years, depending entirely on the species of the fish. And then, boom, one day, all of a sudden, this light goes off in his head, and he decides to go swimming back, not to just any river, but to the river where he was hatched. And he doesn't just swim into the river, he goes into the river and he starts jumping over the waterfalls and makes his way all the way back up high into the mountains in the exact same riverbed where he was spawned. He stops. He digs a hole in the gravel. He lays his eggs. His buddies fertilize him, and the fish dies and commits his life back to the river where he was hatched. Now, that's the complete life cycle of a salmon. Take just a second and think about it. And how much contact did that salmon have with the generation before him and with every generation after him? There wasn't any. There never will be any contact. So that fish didn't learn how to swim upstream and live this incredible life from his folks. Okay. He had information passed on to him, and there was only one point of contact between him and every generation before him and every generation afterward, and it was in that egg. Well, what's in the egg? Nothing but DNA and a little bit of energy to kickstart that whole system and spawn a next generation of a salmon. So that would be observation number one. I do not believe that salmon just figured it out on his own. He was given a script, and the only place that he could have been given a script was written in his DNA. So it wasn't just structural information that he inherited from that last generation, but it was functional. It was activity related. It was information about what his instincts ought to be. Instincts don't just float around in the air. instincts are actually written in DNA, and it makes good sense because if we have information that we need to pass from one generation to the next, it would only make sense that no, that we'd pass it on in DNA, the most powerful biochemical information storage system in the known universe. Okay. So no, I believe that there is a lot more than just structural information in there, but that's not the only observation that I'd like to make to you. I don't know if any of you have been around children who were adopted at birth, but no, I have seen a number of these children, no, both in my life and in my practice and so forth. And no, even though that no, that child never had any contact with his birth family, frequently you will see as that child grows up, sometimes they start acting like the family where that they were biologically conceived from. And in fact, we know that that children that come out of those some of those difficult family situations have similar, not the same, but similar rates of psychiatric disease. They have similar rates of abusive behavior. They have similar rates of drug and alcohol dependence. There are similar rates of all kinds of the same sort of problems, behavioral issues from the biological family that they came from. We'd see some of the same rates of emotional and psychiatric disease that are in these children. There's only one explanation for that, because these children didn't have any contact except for intrauterine contact with their biological family. And even if they picked up those behaviors intrauterine, it makes a pretty good case for being awfully cautious around pregnant ladies and little children. But more importantly, how do these children know how to start acting like their biological family as they grow up, even though they've had no contact with them? It makes sense that part of that emotional program, part of their behavioral program, would be written in DNA. And that does that mean that no, that child is set for life? No, no, of course not. We know that if we put that child into a solid family, that solid family will teach that child and from a behavioral standpoint, modify that child's behavior and mold them into a productive member of that particular family. That doesn't mean that we've completely erased the information that's written in their DNA. It's still there. And in the absence of behavioral modification or behavioral structuring, that child still has a DNA imprint that says, in this particular instance, this is how you should act. And we see that over and over and over again. Case in point, my own children. We see it. There's a famous story that my folks used to love to tell me about. When I was 3 years old, or 3 or 4 years old, thereabouts. They took me to a big shopping mall, long walk, and after making it most of the way, little tiny Timmy got a little tired as a 3-year-old kid, and I started dragging a leg and leaned on my great big 6'5" Uncle Carl, and I said, "Uncle Carl, my legs broke. My legs, I can't walk. I can't walk. My leg broke." Started dragging that leg like it was giving me all kinds of fits, and they laughed and they giggled like you would at any little kid. And I just kept up the ruse until he finally picked me up and carried me back to the car. And as soon as they put me down at the car, of course, I just take off running like I'm a wild child, and everybody got a good laugh out of it. Well, that was all fine and dandy. Some odd years later, many years later, I am the father of a little 3-year-old kid, and we took a long walk at a festival, and on the way back to the car, this little kid starts dragging his leg, saying, Dad, my leg's broke. Dad, my leg's broke. I can't walk. You gotta carry me, Dad. You gotta carry me. My leg's broke." And of course, being the dad that I am, I started to laugh a little bit and said, "How in the world did this kid know at that age, at that time, to reenact this play that was played out almost 2 generations before me?" I'm a little bit of an older dad, But no, I mean, it was just ridiculous. As if the play were being played out from one generation to the next, the exact same script being played out, and I was in awe, but also curious, and a light bulb came on that said, I think there's a lot more in this DNA. How did this kid know how to do that? And if you'll look around, you'll see the exact same thing going on. These children at the exact same age as their parents, playing out some of the same dramas, the same games, the same weird little things that they say. You know, the kid just said something that reminded me of my grandfather, or my dad, or of you, or whatever, from the same time and the same age. Well, it would make a perfect amount of sense if as we're experiencing the world and saying, well, when this happens, this is what I did, and that's the imprint that I created on the world, and that I created as a long-term memory, and stored it in my body and passed it on to the next generation. Well, it gets more interesting because in 2015, there was a researcher in Canada by the name of Rachel Yehuda, and you can look this up and tell me if I'm lying, I'm dying. But in the medical journal Biological Psychiatry in 2015, she published a research piece that she had done about Holocaust survivors and their children. And Dr. Yehuda was a psychiatrist, and noticed that there was a pattern of behavior among Holocaust survivors and their children. The children of these Holocaust survivors were seeking out psychiatric services for anxiety and depression at 300% the rate of the rest of the population in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. So here's the picture. People survived the Holocaust. They made their way to Canada. They had babies. The babies grow up, and the babies start experiencing anxiety and depression at 300% the rate of the rest of the population. That's not 3% more. It's not 30% more. That's three times, 3x the rate of the rest of the population. And nobody really had any idea why this might be. And so Dr. Yehuda, interestingly, drew DNA samples from both the Holocaust survivors and from their children. And guess what she found? In that junk DNA, she found long strings of methylated DNA that you saw in the Holocaust survivors and in their children, but you didn't see in the rest of the population. You didn't see that in the controls. So at this particular, at the exact same locus on I think it was number 15 or something. I don't remember exactly what it was. It's not the important thing where it was. It's the fact that we see a phenomenon going on. We see a group of people with some common background that are experiencing something, and we don't know why. And yet when we look into that DNA, into that junk DNA, there are markers, there are similarities in two generations that you don't see in the rest of the population that's not experiencing these symptoms. Now, that's not to say, just because two things happen at the same time doesn't establish causality. However, the conclusion to that paper was that since we already know that that's in junk DNA, it doesn't really mean anything. Well, there's an old saying that says you can't learn something about something that you already know about. And if you believe you know something about it, regardless of whether you're right or wrong, if you believe you know something about it, it shuts down the ability to learn anything about it. So it is impossible for us to learn something about something that we already know. Let me lay out a little differing philosophy on this. What if, what if our long-term memory were stored in DNA? And so, if that generation that survived the Holocaust saw somebody in a brown shirt and big black boots and had these swastika signs on their shirt, killing their friends and family and locking people up and hurting them and everything else, That is a piece of information, the brown shirt, the swastika, the black boots, and so forth, that would be attached to emotion. All right. If we experience something and we experience some emotion, if you may want to go back an episode or two and see that, that's how we commit things to long term memory. Anytime we attach information to emotion, it gets committed to long term memory. And if you don't believe that, what happened on September 11th, 2001? Where were you and what were you doing? Everybody knows exactly what they were doing because the information that they saw, the planes banging into those buildings, bodies falling over, or bodies falling out of the sky and buildings falling over. We remember that because there was a lot of emotion attached to it. There was shock and anger and fear and empathy and a million other pieces of emotion that were attached to that information. That's how we coagulate long-term memory, guys. Is attaching emotion to information. So go back to the Holocaust survivors. If they are experiencing information, guys in black boots and brown shirts and swastika signs killing their friends and neighbors, and there's going to be a big emotional response. If they stored that information in DNA, wouldn't it be useful as a survival tactic if they were able to pass that information on to the next generation, not in a cognitive sense, where people had a cognitive remembrance of what was happening there, but at an emotional level, because we don't even develop speech and language skills until we're at least a year or two old. And the critical level for speech and language skills is 18 months to 4 years old. Our primary language is not speech, folks. It is emotion. Emotion is the universal language of humanity. It doesn't make any difference if you're laughing, if you're crying, what language we speak. Everybody knows what it is that you're trying to communicate if we're laughing, crying, or expressing emotion, because it is the common language of all human beings. And that's the information that we refer to as living in the gap. It's information, thoughts, feelings, and emotions that connect the physical world to the non-physical world. And I believe that no, that information is stored in DNA, and it only gets stored in DNA if we get emotionally charged about it. So how do we get this information from one generation to the next? Well, listen, if we code up long-term memory in DNA and we pass it on to the next generation, not at a cognitive level, but at an emotional level, somebody who down the road who inherited that DNA wouldn't know why they got excited. They wanted to fight, hide, or run away whenever they saw somebody in black boots, brown shirts, and big swastika signs. They wouldn't know why, but they were having an emotional response that said, fight, hide, run away, and do anything to survive, because if you don't, you are not going to survive this. Wouldn't that be a fantastically useful survival tool to be able to pass information from one generation to the next? Hmm. Yeah, I do too. And I think that's exactly what we've got going on out there, guys. I don't know if anybody has had a child and they were lactating and went out to a restaurant. You handed off the kid to grandma, grandpa, whoever, and said, "See you. We got to have a break from this kid for just a little bit. What have you got? Maybe 2 hours, 3 hours tops." So you go out to a restaurant, you have a nice dinner. No, you're about to get up and leave, and somebody brings a baby into the restaurant. The baby cries, and boom, what happens to that lactating mom? She lets down milk like crazy. Who taught her how to do that? Nobody. It's instinctive. Where do instincts live? Now you know. Now you know that there's a very good chance that they actually live in DNA. DNA, 97% of DNA is not junk, folks. It is not junk. That doesn't follow the pattern of these bodies that waste nothing. These bodies are incredible pieces of machinery, and we don't waste water, we don't waste salt, we don't waste fat, we don't waste protein, we don't waste. Shoot, we break down protein into amino acids. We break down amino acids down to their subcomponents, all the way down to urea, for crying out loud. And we use urea in the kidneys to control the osmolality of the blood. There is nothing, absolutely no biological waste in these physical bodies at all. Why in the world would 97% of the most powerful biochemical information storage system in the known universe be junk? For crying out loud, that theory is junk. No offense to whoever came up with it, but no, for crying out loud, guys, it doesn't follow the right pattern of behavior. Yeah, well, it gets better. Watch this. Nobody knows. Nobody in medicine can tell you why an Alzheimer's patient can tell you what happened 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 70 years ago, but they couldn't tell you what they had for breakfast, even though they've got egg on the corner of their mouth. Well, try this one on for size. If long term memory is stored in DNA and we have access to it via emotions attached to that information, it would make perfect good sense why an Alzheimer's patient has intact long-term memory, but they don't have the ability to store new memories because their brain, the cortex of their brain, is turning into goo. It is all scarred up with all kinds of beta amyloid proteins and so forth, which is scar tissue. But yet they can tell you exactly what happened 50, 60, 70 years ago. Well, now you know why. It's because long term memory isn't stored in your brain, it's stored in DNA, and we have access to it via the limbic system, which is in the base of the brain. It's one of the last parts of the brain that gets affected by Alzheimer's disease. And so their long term memory remains intact, even though they can't put together new short term memories. Hmm. That'll make you go, won't it? Well, what are the implications of all this? Folks, if we have the ability to store long-term memory in our DNA, that means, my friends, that you have been manipulating your own DNA from the time that you were conceived, not from the time that you were born, from the time that you were functionally capable of adding information into that DNA. The implications for this for our entire civilization are massive, absolutely massive. And the reason that that it's time to start talking about this is that now we know how to unlock a life you love. If long-term memory is there, I bet you our emotional program is in there. I'll bet you our instincts are written in there. I'll bet you all kinds of information that we need to know, we need to be able to access, and we need to be able to manipulate to help us unlock a life we love is stored right there. So, what do you think the key to accessing it is? It's emotion, my friends. Emotion is the key to accessing and rewriting or putting in new information in there or eliminating the old. And now you understand why what we're doing here is so critically important. I want you to take a look at the logo that we have put together. We did it on purpose. There's actually four pieces of information in there. If you look, there's a brain. There's also a key, and on the shaft of that key, there's a strand of DNA. I'm not going to tell you what the fourth element is in there, but I want you to look and try and understand and grasp what it is that we're trying to communicate here. What we are sharing with you is civilization changing information, my friends. We are unbelievably powerful pieces of equipment. We are not bodies with souls. We are spirits, powerful spirits expressed in emotion, having a human experience, and the way that we survive this human experience has been passed down to us from generation to generation, and it has worked well. And the evidence of that is staring you in the mirror every day you get up and brush your teeth or comb your hair. Now, my friends, now it is time to start writing that history as we choose to live it and to install whatever emotional program that we would like to experience in this life. And yes, I realize that what I'm saying here is going to cause me some ridicule. And yes, I realize that what I'm saying here will cause me to be scoffed at. That's why I gave up my medical license so that I wouldn't be held accountable to that cult of folks who've been swallowing what they've been fed for a long time. I was not the guy that was going to continue to swallow that without questioning what it was that we were doing and what it was that we were being spoon fed. And I do not believe that 97% of the most powerful biochemical information storage system in the known universe is junk. It is not. It is magically powerful information, and it is the operating system. It is the operating system of our entire lives, our long-term memory included. And now, folks, we know how to start rewriting it. And the power in rewriting it lies in our imagination. We'll talk about that next time, because if you're experiencing a life that you're not necessarily really in love with, guess what? We get to use our imagination to dream up another one and install that new program, and that's how we create a life that we love and unlock a life that we love. Hope I've given you something to scratch your head about and go, this guy's either the craziest dude I've ever met in my life, or we may be onto something totally new. And I've got news for you. I believe we're onto something totally new and something incredibly powerful. Stay tuned, kids, because this is where life starts to take off and we start to unlock a life you love. My name's Dr. Tim Teel. I am the Doc of Unlock. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Unlock a Life You Love podcast. We'll talk to you next time.